Welcome to the 2025 Silber-Obrecht Lecture Conversation event presented by the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, better known as ICJS. I'm Heather Miller-Rubens. I'm the Executive Director and a Roman Catholic Scholar at ICJS, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's special gathering. ICJS, if you're not familiar, we're an independent interreligious educational nonprofit founded nearly 40 years ago and located actually just right across the street from Goucher here. Our mission is to build an interreligious society where dialogue replaces division, friendship overcomes fear, and education eradicates ignorance. We achieve this by fostering communities of learning and dialogue throughout the greater Baltimore area. I'd like to thank our board chairman, Lee Sherman, and other ICJS trustees in attendance this afternoon. In this era, when our culture is devaluing diversity and difference, I'm grateful for their wise and courageous leadership at ICJS. Our organization is literally built on promoting religious difference, and we're just very grateful for their leadership. We're also grateful to Goucher College for hosting today's event in the Unger Athenaeum, named after former Goucher President Sanford J. Unger, who's also an ICJS Emeritus Trustee. To begin the program, I'd like to invite Goucher President Kent Devereaux to share a few words of welcome.
So, welcome everyone to Goucher. And we're very, very pleased to partner with ICJS on the Silber-Obrecht lecture. And really looking forward into next year to be able to do more things together. If anything, I think we understand that this time is a time that needs conversation across difference and really kind of leading into diversity in every aspect. And that means diversity of faiths. On our campus, we become an increasingly diverse population. Today, we're racially, ethnically, we're very, very diverse, and we're 52% non-white. That was not the case 10, 15 years ago. We look like America today, and increasingly we're having more and more international students come to our campus, and they bring with them their faith traditions. And it challenges all of us to basically say, how can they feel welcome in our country, and how we, the nation of immigrants, can make everyone feel welcome in this campus. Sometimes you disagree, that's okay. That's part of an education. That's part of being an American. We firmly believe that. So the conversations about religion and how we can all connect on those things that are the connective tissue that truly is what makes us all human is even more important today, especially with the rapid advance in artificial intelligence, which every week is changing. Our students, this is going to be their life. How do we kind of counter what is human, what are the commonalities that we all share, and what are those differences we can disagree upon, but we can still come together and meet you. So thank you for being here. We want to do everything we can to support the work of ICJS. We're very, very proud of the work that they do. We hope to be able to partner further with ICJS going forward. And quite frankly, you're welcome to come back to Goucher anytime. For other events. So thank you for being here, and I'll pass it back on to Heather.
Thank you so much, Ken. This ICJS Silber-Obrecht Lecture is an endowed biennial lecture series dedicated to advancing the field of interreligious and interfaith studies. This emerging discipline reflects on a growing recognition among both scholars and in society at large that religious pluralism elicits diverse responses. These responses span theology, philosophy, history, scripture, ethics, law, and institutions, all of which deserve thoughtful and rigorous inquiry. The lecture series honors Sidney and Jean Silber and Charles and Margaret Obrecht for their long-standing commitment to strengthening interreligious understanding and fostering interreligious friendships. We welcome members of the Obrecht and Silber families who are here in the audience today. And I want to give a particular remembrance to the late Jean Silber, who passed away this past November. Her generosity of spirit and resources was an inspiration to many, including ICJS. The lecture series is presented by the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies with 5 academic program partners in Baltimore. In addition to Goucher College, they are Johns Hopkins University Agora Institute, Morgan State University Center for the Study of Religion and City, Loyola University of Maryland, and St. Mary's Seminary and University. Our 2025 Silber-Obrecht lecturer is Rabbi Dr. Rachel Mikva, a Herman E. Shulman Professor of Jewish Studies and Senior Faculty Fellow at the Interreligious Institute at Chicago Theological Seminary. Her lecture is entitled, "What Does It Mean to Be Human? Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Perspectives." Rabbi Dr. Mikva's 2-part lecture was pre-recorded and is available with a response from Dr. Yunus Mirza of Shenandoah University on the ICJS website. In today's conversation event, we will engage with the questions and ideas raised in those lectures and see where the conversation takes us. Additionally, a book based on these lectures will be published by Georgetown University Press as part of the Silber-Obrecht lecture series. We want to make today's discussion as interactive as possible with both our in-person audience and our online audience who are streaming from their homes or around the world. So whether you're here at Goucher or watching via live stream, we invite you to participate by submitting questions. We're using an app called Slido, an easy-to-access online tool. Instructions are now displayed on your screen for the online audience. You don't need to download any apps. You can just go to slido.com and enter in tonight's event code. So our event code is 836-1431. I think there are also instructions for the in-person audience on the card in front of you. And you can submit a question at any time, and I'll be using my phone to filter the questions from the audience as our conversation goes forward. So now I think with all the housekeeping out of the way, let's begin the conversation. I'd like to invite Dr. Rachel Mikva and Dr. Yunus Mirza to the stage.
All right, I will get us going here. Thank you both for coming. So the first question is going to be for you, Rachel. You call your lecture a work of theological anthropology. What do you mean by that term, and why is theological anthropology necessary to do in public and interreligiously?
Theological anthropology is just studying what it means to be human. We're just looking at what it means to be human with a religious lens. Because it has the prefix theo, it makes us feel perhaps it's just supposed to be about the study of God. But especially for a monotheistic tradition, the entire earth is all God's, right? So everything in it is a reflection of or in relationship with the divine. So certainly that includes human beings. I'm just going to have notes in front of me, but I'm not going to be able to access them. So you now get my brain that was awake at 3:30 this morning in order to get to the airport on that. So you asked what it is and why we have to do it publicly. So I think that one of the reasons we have to do it publicly is we can't help it. What it means to be human, we have a big stake in that. And so the questions that are generated in theological anthropology are often in public discourse, often at the center of our culture wars or cultural conflicts and questions, or as the president just suggested, just disagreements that are allowed. But and I think that it's important to do interreligiously because if one perspective is mistaken to be a universal one, then it's going to impinge upon civil rights and religious freedom for all the people who don't fit that assumed universal perspective.
To sort of build on that, you make a claim in the lecture that a commitment to pluralism requires that we recognize a broader diversity of convictions about what and who we are. And that kind of builds off of your sort of final thought right now. So could you give us an example of how you think our convictions are expressed too narrowly in public life? And then, we'll start there.
Well, the issue that I addressed in great length in the lecture, because I think it's a prime example and also a very important one, is the idea that a single-celled zygote is defined as a human being by law in certain places in the country. Nobody says, hey, here's a conservative Christian law, but that's really what it is, and it doesn't acknowledge that there's a variety of perspectives about the beginnings of human life. My tradition, the Jewish tradition, teaches that actually the fetus does not have the same status as a human being until the head has emerged during birth. And then you can't set aside one life for the other, but until then, the life of the pregnant person takes precedence. And does not see the fetus as a person. So laws that suggest that the single-celled zygote is already a human being, as we've seen in court cases and state laws, is problematic from a religious freedom perspective, and it establishes really, violates the Establishment Clause. We're not able to pursue that court cases on those terms, but it really does establish religion, a particular interpretation of a particular religion as law. So I think that recognition is only the first step. But as James Baldwin famously said, and I always mess up quotes when I try to quote somebody off the top of my head, but not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until we face it. So I think that we have to acknowledge the ways in which religion collectively and also particular interpretations of it really shape our common life, and we want to approach that work in ways that can have the role of religion in public life and in civic society be more liberative and more inclusive for the wholeness of our society. Another example, a short one, and I'll just name it because it's one I didn't name in the lecture, but I feel very strongly about, are the Native American traditions are not acknowledged in law adequately. So the law does not, because it doesn't fit perspectives about what religion should be, even though we passed in 1978 the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, it still doesn't adequately account for the rights of Native American communities for their waters and their lands that are religiously bound together, because it doesn't fit the perspective of the legal system about religion.
All right, I'm going to try to weave both of those together. So, I think what you're really pointing out is, in the United States context, because of the First Amendment and because of the religion clauses of the First Amendment, we're all in this conversation, whether we want to be or not. And when you're holding Jewish, Roman Catholic, Muslim, Native American, all of these forms of spirituality and religiosity under this idea of religious liberty, we're going to need to have this conversation. That's sort of my summary statement, and I'll move into the question. I think going back to the question of when life begins, and you set up a kind of a good thought experiment for us to kind of go further, when you've got a kind of Catholic seamless garment of life from the moment of conception until natural death. This is the scope of life, versus a sort of Jewish understanding of the life of an infant or a baby begins at birth. How do we manage and honor and navigate diverse convictions like that in our democracy?
I can do that standing on one foot, right? look, we're all doing this work, right? We're doing it on the micro scale by building relationships. In building relationships, we really build understanding, right? People don't respect Islam because they learn 7 pillars. They begin to respect Islam because they meet Muslims that they respect. And I think that through building relationship and building understanding, we then recognize, we want to create a fabric in our society that works for you too, right? So in the micro scale, I think a lot of our organizations are already doing this work. How do you scale it up and say, how do we, I think that there are many people working in the courts and in law firms and through legal systems, through legislatures, who are trying to make it a more inclusive society. I think you can, I think I can't remember their names, Charles Sukup and James Keaton, I think, although I may flip their first names. They talk about humanizing and dehumanizing discourse. And you can be a pluralist and still treat somebody in a dehumanizing way, right? We can absolutize pluralism too, just as well as we can absolutize exclusivism. But to work in a humanizing, with a humanizing set of principles would model compassion and understanding and wanting to make, wanting not to misrecognize, or one of the things that we do, unfortunately, when we disagree these days, is we deliberately or not misrecognize difference, and we see it as something far more dangerous and far more abhorrent to us than it probably is. We don't actually try to understand other people. So, I don't think there's a magic bullet. I think this work is ongoing. Unfortunately, I think there are a lot of trends right now that are trying to undo some of the work that's already been done. I don't know, how political can I be?
You are our lecturer, so please.
In the current government, there are a large number of Christian nationalists who believe in formally reinstating established Christianity, a particular version. This isn't great for all Christians, because it's a lot of Christians would really disagree with what they're trying to do. But it's a regime change. This is what the Fetterman Foundation calls it, Christian nationalist regime change. They're really trying to rewrite the way America works and thinks. And so I think it proves to those of us who've been in this sphere for a long time, this work is ongoing. And like all work where we don't all agree about it, if you don't keep pushing, it's going to be backsliding. And sometimes there's a reaction even though we've been continually working on it.
Sliding into your lectures, and even really now we're talking about contemporary events, and what do we look at when we look at our political society and we look at our interlocutors and we dehumanize them or are dehumanized in the process. We believe at ICJS that dialogue is a rehumanizing activity, especially if it's sort of ongoing with folks. But I think there's this core question that you bring out that I want to talk about with the audience today, which is that are we good? Are we humans good? And there's a kind of a self-reflexive way to think about that. Like, I'm worried if I'm good and if I'm doing the right thing and behaving the right way. But then I'm also looking at my neighbor or my political interlocutor and saying, well, is she good? Is he good? Do I trust them to build a world that I can safely live in? And so there's this other aspect of it that's kind of regulating other folks, right? So other people's behavior and your behavior at play at this question, this rich question you brought to us, are we good? And you lift up an idea to answer that question from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I'm wondering if you can briefly sort of summarize that framework of your answer for the audience quickly right now.
Sure. The first, I'll share one of my favorite things to say in terms of navigating difference is you're more likely to be able to appeal to their heart if you assume that they have one. So I think that when we look at the other, we need to try to imagine that they have a heart. But so this is the question that got me into this mess. So I was just so completely fascinated. Judaism teaches that we are born with a yetzer tov, a good inclination, and a yetzer hara, a bad inclination. And we choose between them in every moment. And that's what Torah is all about guiding us to make good choices. And bad, sometimes it actually gets translated as the evil inclination, and that's very misleading. Because it's not really like you have an angel sitting on one shoulder and a devil on the other. It's more like your ego and your id. The rabbis are very clear, you need both of these aspects, but the point is how do you take these diverse human drives and do good with them? Right? But we are the agent of always navigating those innate aspects of our being. And then I contrast that with what became after Augustine, sort of standard Christian theology of original sin, where after the Adam and Eve's disobedience, eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the idea that an inherent sinful nature is transmitted to all of humanity for all time, so that we are not sinners because we've committed some sins, but rather we sin because we already are born sinners. Well, I'll qualify everything in a minute, but I'll just state them in the short. And then fitra, and this was the last one I learned maybe, 25 years ago. In Islam, the idea is that we're born with an innate capacity for goodness and to recognize goodness and God and to want to draw close to them, right? And it's not that we're not capable of doing bad stuff, right? Just as the Christian idea of original sin doesn't mean that we can never do anything good. But these very different foundational imaginings of what is human nature, what's sort of basic to our being, was just so interesting to me. And the more I looked into it, of course, the more varied the voices are within each tradition and the more commonalities you find between them. But nonetheless, these distinctions abide.
Eunice, when in your response, you take up Rachel's question, are we good? And you actually don't really move into fitra right away. You go to the Quran and to the sort of creation story, and talk about angels objecting to the creation of humanity to God. And I'm wondering if you could sort of summarize that story, sort of building off of fitra, but sort of add to that with your expertise.
All right, great. So thanks so much, and it's a really honor to be here and to be a respondent to Rachel. It's a lot easier to discuss Rachel's idea and to respond to them than to actually produce what she did. So I want to add to what Rachel is saying, the importance of relationships in religious studies, and that really comes out in the Quranic story. So in the Quranic story, God is creating Adam and Eve, and the angels actually object initially, and they say, why would you do such a thing? And why would you create a species that would create bloodshed on earth? So there is essential from the very beginning, this idea of relationships, that these new beings that you're going to create are going to cause mayhem. They're going to hurt other people. They're going to harm. And then God responds and says, no, I know best. And goes ahead and creates Adam and then Eve. So we see in that story there is this intentionality that humans have the capacity to be good. Angels claim that monopoly. They say, hey, we're the best, right? We're good. And God says, no, there's actually humanity that can also be good. They have the capacity to do bad, but they also have this capacity to do good. And even though that verse doesn't mention the word fitrah, I think it is implied. And one of the things I admire about Rachel's work is she's able to talk about certain themes, whether it's interreligious studies or dangerous ideas, from a Jewish, Christian, Islamic perspective. And I like the way she presented the idea of fitrah, that humans are essentially created good in the Islamic tradition. They have the capacity to do evil and wrong, but they have this inclination to recognize God and to serve others. So that's really, I think, at the heart of the story, that we are relational, that we're human beings, that we have the capacity to do good and evil, but God chooses to create humanity because they have the potential to do what's right.
We screened the lectures with some in-person audiences over the last couple of weeks and had some great conversations. I'm going to draw off of those conversations. I see a couple of folks in the audience today. Thank you for helping me craft today's questions. And the audience was really interested in this idea that you're pointing to, Eunice, about there being an innate sense when humans are born towards God or towards the good in some way. And the conversation sort of shifted into the nature-nurture debate that happens in sort of psychology and human development. And I'm wondering if either of you might want to sort of think about the nature-nurture debate and how it relates to your respective theological anthropologies.
Well, I think obviously particular religion is taught, right? So when in the lecture, I distinguish Islamic thinkers who talk about sort of capital M Muslim, right, as a taught religion versus this innate small m Muslim, that capacity and innate desire to draw close to the divine, something transcendent. So I think obviously particular religion is taught, but there are many aspects of our nature that align with religious thought and practice. Most researchers consider them to be an evolutionary byproduct, right? We didn't develop them in order to develop religion, but religion makes really good use of these cognitive abilities that we develop for other reasons. For example, our brains are wired to discern or create order and attach meaning to things. Religion does great with meaning and order and ritual and all of these things that make great use of it. The skills, the cognitive abilities are developed for survival. You can see why they would also be helpful for that, but religion makes use of them. Similarly, we have an instinct for personalization, to imagine that everything that happens in the universe actually has some relevance to us. I would argue that these days I'm a little worried about that tendency because it shows up a lot as narcissism, but it has a value for survival, right? We have to observe the world and see, is something going to kill us? Is that thing out there being a danger to us, or can it help us? Is it good? And religion, it also is central to ideas of revelation and providence, right? That the God, the creator of the universe, would be intimately involved with our lives. So there are these innate things about being human that align with religious thought, which is while religions vary greatly, there is a spiritual dimension and transcendent thinking in so many cultures all around the world.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think we're living in a time period in higher education where humanities and religious studies is under attack, and there are various universities shutting down even departments of religious studies and centers. So to Rachel's point, that this idea of spirituality as a fundamental human part of existence, I think really resonates with me. And it should be part of not just ICJS, but part of a high school and college curriculum where religion is taught as not necessarily doctrinal or creedal, but in terms of trying to understand the human experience. And I think as you were speaking, Heather, it reminded me of this notion also in Islam of fitra, but also the idea of hanif. So the early Muslim community in Arabia, they're understood to be believers, the believing community. Others understood them to be hunafa, or the people that were trying to revive the monotheism of Ibrahim. So there is this Quranic verse that talks about Abraham as a hanif muslima. So he is someone who is a monotheistic, and he is someone who is a Muslim with this maybe a lowercase m, meaning a submitter. So no one would say that, oh, Ibrahim made the shahada, for instance, that there's only one God and Muhammad is his messenger, in the sense that Muhammad hadn't even existed at that time and he wasn't born. But there was this conception that he is a submitter. He's someone who recognizes God. So I think Islam, as it emerged within Arabia, within the 7th century, was trying to revive this understanding of fitrah, of hanif, of being a believer, being monotheistic, trying to recognize God, and also revive certain biblical traditions that had been lost within Arabian paganism and polytheism.
I want to sort of play around a little bit more with the Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer Hara. And one of our online questions, just a reminder, I am checking. We've got a couple coming in, so I'm going to try to pepper those in as well. This idea of a good inclination and a bad inclination is also something we talked about over the last a couple of weeks, and whether having both is actually good. And again, a wonderful ICJS contributor brought up that there's a Star Trek episode where Captain Kirk, there's a whole episode where there's a good Captain Kirk and a bad Captain Kirk. And so they take the bad Captain Kirk and they lock him away. And then the good Captain Kirk can't be a captain. He stops being able to make decisions and to lead and to do all of this. And so then they realize, well, they've got to get bad Captain Kirk back out of jail and sort of smush him back together in order for him to lead. Hopefully, I'm not a Star Trek aficionado, so hopefully, okay.
I always said he got split in a transporter accident.
Okay,
so
all right.
parts of the same.
So you are the right person to ask this question for so many reasons. Okay, so can we talk about this a little bit more, and whether or not you need both in order to really be human, and that maybe that combo is what's good?
Well, the rabbis didn't know Star Trek, but they did have their own story that they told about this. They imagined, and I mentioned this in the lecture. They imagined that they captured the Yetzer Hara. Right. Again, they're thinking mythologically. And they call it a he. So forgive me that we're going to gender this now. They lock him up, and they want to kill it, right? Because you think it's against our right. You want to get rid of it. We don't want this aspect of humanity. And he persuades them that if you kill me, you're not going to be dead. You just won't survive. So prudently, they lock him up instead. And they notice that no chicken lays an egg, and another version of where the story is told, no man builds a house. So this is their way of saying some of those drives that, their chicken laying an egg, I think, was their way of talking about sexual desire, which can sometimes be problematic, although the rabbis are pro-sex within sanctified relationships. They just recognize that sexual desire can be problematic within human drives. And the man building a house, the using of natural resources for our welfare and building my own space for me, or whatever that self-centered instinct is to build the house and take from the world to create for my own comforts. That if you take away those drives, we won't survive as a species. So the way the rabbis talk about it is that all of our instincts, Yetzer Tov, Yetzer Tov, and Yetzer Hara, can be directed to the Most High. That's the way they would think about it. You can make them all serve God. But recognizing that that drive can also lead away from that. So that's their Star Trek.
Thank you. So I want to kind of go back to the idea of being interreligious in public. And what does it mean to have two amazing exegetical scholars of the Quran and the Bible here on stage and to be talking about these questions in public, to be adding to the public square. Rachel, in your first lecture, I'm quoting you back right now, you say, "I'm not trying to demonstrate that religious ideas matter or have something to contribute to thinking about what it means to be human. I think it's obvious that they do." So what does this mean for those who are not religious? Can serious thinking about what it means to be human happen outside of religious tradition? And how would we include them in this public conversation?
Absolutely. I think language is part of it. I actually prefer to talk about life stances because I don't like talking about secular humanists and atheists and folks who don't identify with a religion per se by what they're not. So I don't like talking about religious and not religious people. But I like to talk about our life stances. But language is only part of it. I think, especially around questions of what it means to be human, we absolutely need all of the sources of value and learning in order to figure out how to be in the world in the best way and how to be with each other in the best way. We need science, and we need history, and we need ethics, and we need politics, and we need all of these in addition to what religion can contribute. So I definitely did not mean to suggest that, religion has these answers that these other ways of knowing and being can't figure out. I just feel like the conversation is richer when we all bring our deepest sources of value into this space.
Eunice, would you want to weigh in about being kind of interreligious in public and the inclusion of folks with various life stances?
So definitely in terms of interreligious, and I would encourage folks to read Rachel's book. She just came out this last year on interreligious studies. And one of the things she mentions in the definition in the first chapter is the idea of relational. So interreligious studies is relational. So interreligious studies is different than world religions, where you're just studying different understandings of the world and different religious practices and locating them in different geographical places. It has this connotation, and I felt this here actually since I've been spending some time here at ICJS, of forming relationships with people of other faiths, of other life stances, of other backgrounds. And this is an important question, Heather, because I teach the Quran and the Bible almost every year at Shenandoah, and my students vary from year to year. And this year I have a group of students who are primarily Christian, who grew up in Christian families, and many of them have learned the Bible, and they're making Bible references in class. And to the point that one of the students came afterwards and said, I'm an atheist. I don't identify, I'm agnostic. I don't identify with any religion. Is that going to somehow hurt me in this class? And I mentioned that, no, learning or studying the Bible beforehand, that's not prerequisite. You're welcome in this class. Bring whatever experiences you do have, because those experiences are valuable and they're relevant. And talk about the larger issues that we're discussing, whether that's being human, whether that's the idea of hope, whether that's the idea of your relationship with the world. There is a way for you to connect in this class. And she's taken that to heart and now studying and working on questions of feminism within the various religious traditions, as well as the idea of women's rights. So I think in our discussions in interreligious studies, we do have to have that door open. And our language sometimes can be exclusive, that we're only speaking to particular people. So if we can somehow broaden that language, I like Rachel's suggestion of life stances, and also speak about general themes that our various traditions hold, and also larger goals, whether that be of social justice, of eliminating hunger, whether that be a climate change, whether that be of gender equality. If we speak I think in larger terms that even people of no faith or of faith can relate to, that will strengthen our work.
I love that you brought up the classroom, because of course, for you and me, this is where we learn the most, right? This is when theoretically we're teaching students, but they're obviously teaching us much more. So when I first came to ICJS in 2009, it was a Protestant seminary affiliated with the United Church of Christ. It's still affiliated with the United Church of Christ, but it's about 30% Protestant now. They originally endowed the Church of Studies because they believed that to be a religious leader in this multi-faith context, you need to know something about a religion other than your own, and Judaism seemed like the right chair to start with because of the long history of relationship between Jews and Christians. And I didn't do this on purpose, it sort of happened around me, but we became known as a place where you could come and do theological education even if you didn't fit inside a tidy box. We have lots of folks who are interspiritual, and folks who are, don't have other places to do theological education. For a while, we had a lot of pagan students. Right now, that's not quite, doesn't seem to be quite as trending, but still have some pagan students. And then we went into partnership with Bayan Islamic graduate schools, so now our student body is about 40% Muslim, about 40% various kinds of Christians, and 20% folks who are Jewish or Buddhist or Hindu or atheist or pagan or secular humanist or interspiritual. And just them doing their formation work together is transformative for the whole institution.
I want to turn now to some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. I will start with this one. Is the basis for religious freedom itself religious or secular?
Well, I almost always want to answer questions that come at me as binaries by answering both. So I feel that way about it, nature and nurture. I probably feel that way about this as well. But, so I think about a lot of religious systems, as they're seeking to establish themselves, even if they only imagine themselves not as universally true, but as true for their community, do not necessarily embrace freedom as a top 10 value. Right? They want freedom from other things that prevent them from becoming this community. But as they're trying to find this community, freedom is probably not top of the list. So in the formative stage of religions, I think it's rare that spiritual freedom is a prime value. Nonetheless, there are other values within religion that I think guide us toward, especially living in multi-faith contexts, guide us toward a religious embrace of freedom, such as honoring the humanity within every person. So human dignity and for my tradition, one of the most commonly repeated biblical refrains in Torah is, "You shall not oppress the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt." You know the heart of the stranger, right? So the religious teaching of empathy ultimately can and should lead to an embrace of religious freedom for people. But I think we have to acknowledge that it came out of a secular Enlightenment context as a value to embed within the national experiment of America of separating religion and state, so that it could not only be free, right? The free exercise is only part of it. It's also an establishment, obviously. Not establishing religion is the other part, but what I wanted to say actually was it liberates us from having religion thrust upon us, but it also liberates religion to be, I mean, America is a unique thing in how religious and vibrantly religious it is in the West. And I think part of that is the national experiment. But my short answer is both. It came from both.
I will weigh in here with my scholarly hat as well to answer the question, and I'm also cognizant that we're on the 60th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council, when you have Nostra Aetate, which is the church's sort of declaration about its new relationship to religions outside of Catholicism and outside of Christianity. And I don't think you can read Nostra Aetate without also reading the church's declaration Dignitatis Humanae, which is about religious freedom. And that those two Vatican documents need to be read together to really understand the revolution that the church was undergoing at that time. And I will just also throw in a plug for the United States role in that you had sort of American Catholic thinkers and priests really driving the theological logic in Dignitatis Humanae at the Vatican. And so I think that for Catholic tradition, the idea of religious freedom had to be understood with religious diversity, and it really was only grappled with in the current form about 60 years ago. So looking at some of the other questions are coming in here. So going back to theological anthropologies, can the truth of various religious anthropologies be measured, at least in part, by their explanatory power to illuminate what's going on in the world?
Say that again.
It's a good question. Can the truth of various religious anthropologies be measured, at least in part, by their explanatory power to illuminate what's going on in the world?
Yes. I'm not a huge fan of attaching the word truth to, that's not what I'm searching for in my religion. I don't feel my religion has a unique handle on truth. I think that my religion has a unique way of making meaning in my life and in my community. So, but I do think that going back to the question about the innate qualities of some aspects of our religious natures, we do want to explain the world. For those of us who are religious, we want our religion to help us make sense of what's going on. One day I was cracking a lecture about G.K. Chesterton, who said original sin is like the best proven Christian principle ever, because every person you know does something really terrible. And I think that in the way that the theologies developed, they were trying to explain big questions about the world, maybe not a particular political moment, but big questions about why, if God is all powerful, why is it this world so imperfect, and why is there suffering? And so I think religions have always tried to reach to explain some of the critical questions of our time. And I think that people reach into their religious values to respond when they're pressed by crises or trauma or anxieties of what's happening in the world. But as I talk about a lot in the lecture, those values themselves are sort of mongrel history. They're created out of a whole host of things. Partly are religious values, partly are communities, partly are historical experiences, partly are whatever all those different sources of values are in our lives, they might get attached to our religion, but they come from many sources. So like most things, answer yes and, or yes but.
Would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, so I think regarding maybe referencing Rachel's lecture and also maybe Heather's recent blog post, that when there is crises, people resort to this, are their values or their religious toolbox. So whether that's, you mentioned AI, and you mentioned also the question of abortion. Also, Heather, in a recent blog post, mentioned the idea of a storm that we're all kind of in currently, and we're trying to find our particular way out. So in those moments, I think all of us do retreat back to our values and where those values originate from. Do they originate from relationships, people we know, a church, a mosque, a synagogue, scripture? So I think part of Rachel's project, which I found very fascinating, is excavating, right? And I mentioned in the lectures that I saw Rachel with a big shovel and digging out for us and making apparent where these religious ideas come from. So I think, to Rachel's earlier point, that for us to change, we would have to see where the origins are. Why do we believe what we believe? How do we come to this particular moment? Why have these policies or laws developed? And then after we've seen or excavated those ideas, then we could imagine a new future that could be potentially even better. So I think that's a key point within Rachel's lecture that I think we could reflect and develop.
Something you said, Eunice, was making me think about, I think perhaps more than any particular truth, our religious values and religious capacities can ignite for us in difficult moments key strategies to survive and perhaps even thrive. Right? And I think the capacity for hope is one of them, and that's not the idle faith that everything's going to be fine, but rather an active faith that the world can be different than it is, and that we have a critical part to play in it. And I think that that's, again, found across many different traditions, is the capacity to nurture resilience, the capacity to nurture hope, the capacity to help us want to be in community together, right? So rather than a truth, there are these strategies of meaning-making and strategies of survival that I think are key to the role of religion in moments like this.
Building off of that, you have a nice point in your lecture, Rachel, about moments when there are threats or advances to meaning making, sort of scientific in particular. You sort of talk about the sort of movement of understanding not that the earth isn't the center of the universe, but the sun is the center of our universe. You sort of talk about Darwin and sort of understanding evolution, and how that these questions, when you're in a storm or a moment of crisis and meaning making, that can be coming from sort of technological and scientific advances. In this current moment, we're thinking a lot about AI, and even our welcome comments from President DeVreaux also talked about this. And so what does it mean to take up this question, what is a human in this moment of AI? Rachel, you did a great job of asking ChatGPT to generate some images to go along with her lectures. And so we decided, well, let's feed the lectures into ChatGPT and see what kind of questions come out. And so I'm going to do a little experiment here and say that these are ChatGPT questions that I'm going to ask both of you about your lectures, and then we'll go back to sort of audience questions. So for ChatGPT question number 1 for Rachel, what are the risks and benefits of believing that there is something quote unquote special about being human? How might this belief both inspire ethical behavior and contribute to destructive attitudes such as environmental exploitation or anthropocentrism?
Wow, I like ChatGPT. They read the whole lecture. So in this Anthropocene age, we've been forced to grapple with the destructive effects of imagining that the whole earth is ours to use for our own pleasures and purposes. And I want to focus on this risk, partly because it's Earth Day, and partly, mostly, because it's just so critical. Right? We are in the midst of, we see on the precipice of climate disaster, and we seem not to have the collective will to change necessary changes in behavior. And I've heard people of faith say that God won't let us destroy the earth because we're so special, we're central to God's plan for the universe. And, well, you know, if we are going to destroy the earth, maybe then it was God's plan, but if it was God's plan, then that's okay. Or various ways in which the sort of using religion to be complacent about the climate crisis. And I think any faith, you know, you could find a life stance that can, so let me start that sentence over. Every life stance can be interpreted in ways to foster that kind of complacency, but there have always been counter voices and counter teachings that offer alternatives to the anthropocentrism and to the politics of fear and greed and extraction and colonization. So, Job is one of my favorite examples of anti-anthropomorphic teachings, right? This is really not all about you, Job. There's also a 10th century midrash that says, humans, animals, fish, birds, we're all interconnected, we all depend on one another, we all breathe the earth's air, we all drink the earth's water, we all eat the foods that are available from the earth, and what happens to one of us is going to happen eventually to all of us. So we've known this for a really long time. Biblical traditions also understand that we are made of the same stuff as the rest of the universe, right? The Adam, the human, is made from the Adamah. And in the Quran, it's also, the human made from the clay of the earth. So I think that it's critical that we, recognize that interconnectedness and face the moment, right? So the risk of thinking that we're special is, God won't let anything happen. At the same time, it's really important to remember that we're special because that is part of what nurtures our capacity for hope, that God has a stake in our existence and our continuation. And I think that the primary messaging strategy of addressing climate change is you've got to do something or else we're all going to die, right? And that's actually not a very effective messaging strategy. Social science has demonstrated this time and again. If you tell people, you got to do X or we're all going to die, a surprising number, a majority, opt for door number 2. As surprising as that is, because overwhelming fear leads people to disengage. If you don't really believe you have agency, then you just don't do anything about it. So the prophet Isaiah, it's there as well. He tells the Israelites they have to change their ways to avert disaster, and he describes the disaster with such compelling detail. They say, let's eat and drink because tomorrow we're going to die. Right? So, Catherine Keller calls it critically plausible nihilism. And other people have named it utilitarianism. Right? And it leads to the same place as denial. Right? If you don't think you can do anything about it, or it's already too late, then it will lead to the same kind of complacent behaviors. So I think we do have to embrace that dialectic to recognize, we're not some creature that is up above the status of the earth and won't be impacted by what we're doing with the climate. At the same time, we do have the resources. We have the imagination and the technological gift to avert some of the worst possibilities if we, do really go all out on carbon capture and alternative sources of energy and changing human behaviors and habits and leading into an ethic of simplicity and compassion and all of that. So I like ChatGPT's kind of
dialectical approach, that's very rabbinic.
So Eunice, here's your Chat GPT question. It actually kind of builds off of this idea of creation care and environmental threat. So debate the potential for more sustainable and empathetic interpretations that position humans not as dominating creation, but as stewards of creation.
Okay, great. So this is something I reflected upon and tried to address in the lecture was translation. And one of the key words in that verse that we discussed earlier is that God in the Quran says that I want to create a khalifa. So there have been different interpretations on what this means. Is it a vicegerent? Is it a trustee? And some of the interpretations do have this idea of God creating a representative, almost a mini God, that these people are going to represent God on earth. And I push back on that interpretation and that translation and try to argue for more of the idea of amana or of a trusteeship. So to Rachel's idea and point that even in the Islamic tradition, there is this kind of conception that the world everything revolves around us and we're central. But if we rather look at other interpretations to see humans as a form of creation as well, and that the animals are a form of creation, the animals have families as well, and that they have communities and they have language. And there are certain things that we can maybe even empathize with animals rather than just see them as subservient to human beings. So I think there is both within the Islamic tradition. There is this idea of domination and that the earth is subservient to us and that we should continue to use it and exploit it, while there is another interpretation that I think is gaining more dominance, the idea of humanity being part of creation and seeing creation as similar to human beings and that we need to take care of it as part of God's will.
Thank you. We'll go back to audience questions now, but we always know Chat GPT is here if we need him or her. So here's a great question. Aren't some issues or policies inherently non-plural? For example, doesn't any position on euthanasia, if it's acceptable, limited, forbidden, correlate with some religious position?
So I would say the same would be true. You could say that, make that same claim about abortion, you can make that same claim about capital punishment, right? So, where we're talking about the actions of individuals, I mean, this goes to sort of my version of pluralism. So, when we're talking about the actions of individuals, I would like to see the law enable individual choices within the broadest possible ethical spectrum that the society represents. So I think that would apply to euthanasia, that would apply to abortion. When it's an action of the state, like capital punishment, then obviously you have to figure out what the state is going to do. But I actually feel like, in terms of the culture wars, many of them really don't have to be at each other's throats because they really are about these individual choices. And if we don't try to exert our will on everybody else's choices, we can coexist more amicably. I think if you're going to have a job of public service, if you're going to be a clerk or a pharmacist or a baker or a website designer, and yes, those are obviously all real cases, that you need to serve all the public, right? That's not so much it's a little different than the question came in, but I think it's part of what it is to live in a plural society with diverse religious ideas because we're walking around with them and they affect so many issues. and if you're going to accept government funds, I think that to provide public services, I think you have to abide by anti-discrimination laws. I think those are obvious things. But I think that the challenge for us ought to be, this isn't where we find ourselves, but the challenge for us ought to be, how do you figure out what is the ethical range of what the society can support and would support? Euthanasia is a great example for that, right? You don't want to cheapen life, you don't want people to start, thinking economically about how long somebody should live in their later years, right? All of the slippery slope stuff that people who stand against euthanasia talk about. Nonetheless, I think there's a real case to be made for allowing euthanasia to be legal and to minimize suffering in certain cases. But how would, even if we had the collective will to go that way, we watch other countries who are trying to figure this out, how do you figure out what that range is that represents the broad ethics of the community? Because there are differences, but there's a collective space.
I've got a question leaning into both of your expertise as exegetical scholars of scriptural interpretation. How do you each deal with texts and religious traditions that dehumanize, especially when they give religious cover for dehumanization in the contemporary world? I know you wrote a book about this to a certain extent, but I think, Eunice, you should go first. So
it's always easier when Rachel goes first, and then I can respond. But I guess it depends on which text and which particular verses or prophetic traditions or commentaries. I guess one that comes to mind even in the modern period, for me at least, is the idea of slavery and how that represents particular domination, and how sometimes that can be used even by extremist movements to subjugate particular people and religious communities. So referencing one of the articles I've written on this topic is how these texts sometimes have been even used to revive practices that we thought were historic or medieval, and these texts now are actually being used to implement slavery or sexual exploitation. So I think really reading those texts closely, and then with their commentary, and seeing what these texts, their context, how are they implemented or understood during their time period, and then how could they be interpreted in the modern world, is essential. And that's, I think, a very difficult task to do. I think sometimes it's easy to become lazy and just kind of quote a verse here and there, and then not necessarily understand where it fits within a particular chapter or tradition. So I think even with my work, trying to look at some of the commentaries and trying to see that actually these texts that people are quoting to revive certain practices are actually saying the opposite, that they're focusing more on emancipation or restricting slavery and so forth. So I think really doing that deep work, the excavating, trying to understand what that text meant in that particular time period, how did the commentators understand it, and then having a modern discussion of how is it relevant today.
I do think that looking at our tough texts helps to cultivate self-critical faith for those who have that capacity. I think it's very helpful. In the book that you were referencing, in the Dangerous Religious Ideas book, I tell a story that Susan Thistlethwaite told me when she was editing Interfaith Just Peacemaking. So Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars were getting together to talk about the just peace principles and how they manifest in their traditions, and how they could write a book together about it.
And everybody was insisting, well, my religion is a religion of peace. My religion is, all honey, beautiful, holy, great. So they finally agreed, because they weren't getting anywhere, to bring their worst text, right? And finally there was some honest and open and vulnerable conversation about what do you do about these texts that are so problematic. And how do you grapple with them within the way you approach your tradition? And it was transformative. So I do think it can really help to cultivate self-critical faith. I always ask my students when they sort of fall into easy proof texting to make their point, like, you actually don't believe, because this is a progressive seminary, you don't actually believe that these words were uttered by God. These are human texts. So what are you proving with your proof text? And I get them to think about it more, why are we looking at these texts to begin with? And so from that perspective, they develop a very rich capacity to understand the relationship with Scripture as a guide to the questions and not the answers, as a witness that we've been here before, and God has been with us, and we move through together, and various things depending on the moment and the text. But it isn't, oh look, I'm right because the text says that. So for people who approach the text in a more absolutist way, they can be way more fraught. But this is where I think, as you suggest, that the excavating the history of interpretation helps to demonstrate no text has always meant what you think it means. Right? It's always had multiple interpretations. It's always meant different things. What makes yours the absolute truth and not your version of your interpretation of the text? And I think that makes the history of exegesis work important.
Here's a question that I'm going to adapt so that you both can answer and reflect on it. I was wondering if you could reflect on your identity as religious people and scholars. So how has your rabbinical work, your Jewish identity helped ask these types of questions? How has your Muslim identity helped ask these types of questions? And then how do you sort of sit with a scholarly posture as well?
So that's a great question, and I think part of my training in my PhD program, and sometimes there was an assumption that your religious identity somehow gets in the way of your scholarship or clouds it. And one of the reasons why I've been attracted to interreligious studies and organizations like ICJS is the idea that you can be a scholar and also confessional at the same time, that they somehow are not in conflict. And as someone who is Muslim, I always appreciate different religious perspectives, even on Islam. So, hearing Rachel's thoughts or Heather's or, Matthew Taylor's, I think all of those are enriching. And it's nice to be part of a field of Islamic studies where you hear and engage in multiple religious perspectives. So I think there is this opening space that I've seen in the last maybe 5-10 years. It's growing, this move that you don't necessarily, people understand that your background is important, your religious experience, that this idea that someone's objective is not entirely true, that someone is motivated by faith and spirituality, and that could actually lead them to produce cutting-edge scholarship. So I've seen that space grow within the academy, and I've seen that space also grow within the community as well, within congregations that are valuing scholarship more and valuing people who've actually have advanced degrees and have gone to seminaries. So I've also noticed that with my students, that I ask my students to bring themselves into the classroom, and that oftentimes is their faith or their engagement with Scripture, whether good or bad. And that always makes the classroom more exciting and interesting when people are honest about what they believe and explain the histories behind their particular values. So I think interreligious studies has this potential to really contribute to the academy as a whole and to American democracy and pluralism, because it combines both of these two of scholarship and confessional faith.
That's beautiful. So you kind of answered broadly, so I'll answer very individually. So I did all of my training within seminaries. I trained to be a rabbi in a seminary, at Hebrew College, Jewish Institute of Religion, and I did my doctoral work at Jewish Theological Seminary, and I teach at Chicago Theological Seminary. So although I know about it, I actually have never experienced that, any professor is trying to problematize the confessional aspect of my being in the way that I study religious studies. But I do think, and for me, there's very little conflict. I think I'm in many ways more shaped in the way my brain works by the academy than by my tradition. And I'll take the skills from the academy to analyze the tradition more than vice versa. But there's an Orthodox Jewish Bible scholar named James Kugel who wrote a book, How to Read the Bible, and it's wonderful historical, critical analysis of the Bible. And then there's a chapter at the end where he says, how do I do this work as an Orthodox Jew? And I was so excited to get to this last chapter, and I didn't feel like he had yet figured it out. He's, I think he may be emeritus by now, so he may be out of time to figure it out. But I think those tensions are very real for a lot of people who are trying to do both. For me, it's been very formative to have both those dimensions of my being when I'm doing work in the public square. So there's a similar letter going out all around the country from Jewish organizations and Jewish communities saying that really the weaponization of fighting anti-Semitism by violating the rule of law and stripping people of civil rights is not, we do not support this. This is not at all about fighting anti-Semitism, and it in fact problematizes the fight against anti-Semitism for all these XYZ reasons. But there are plenty of people who don't stand in the academy and the confessional world doing these letters and doing this work, but for me, that kind of critical work of the moment is so determined by those two paths, or those two shoes, or whatever part of my work I'm thinking today.
Going back to sort of AI for a minute, could you imagine a scenario in a generation or two that AI would dictate or determine our behaviors in a way that religion does or did? Would that change our quote-unquote nature? So again, thinking more, or we'll put our Star Trek visionary goggles back on to imagine our future with AI and its capacity to change human nature and capacity to change religion. I think if I'm understanding the question.
It's such a fascinating question. I actually think Afrofuturism is a way better sort of world to embrace, to think about the changing nature of the human in the future by the things that are. But I know the Star Trek world a little better than the literature of Afrofuturism. So I'm not sure I have anything intelligent to say about that question. Lots of people are speculating, is AI going to become a new religion? So I think there's an aspect of that in the question. Let me just forward the question. Maybe that's what I can do. Then you can say something intelligent. So one thing it's asking is, as a phenomenon and as a source of information and of meaning, can it in fact
become a new religion. And, I would say since QAnon could become a new religion, yes, it could. But I think more likely is it will impact the way we all think about all of our religions. I just don't know how we might.
Yeah, I missed some episodes of Star Trek, so I feel like I'm not totally equipped to answer this question. But I think with AI and the emergence of AI has made me think more about what AI can do and what it can't do. So I think one of the things as a scriptural scholar and student, I'm focusing more on the focus on the body. So there's so much discussion within the Bible or the Quran about the creation of Adam or Eve or even Cain and Abel. One of the stories I mentioned in my lecture was that Cain and Abel in the Quran actually get into a dispute, and then Cain eventually will kill Abel, and then a crow will come and point to Cain on how to bury his brother. So this idea, you still have to honor the body. You have to honor your brother, even though he's passed away. So I think that's where a lot of my thinking has gone, is yes, AI is an incredible, intelligent tool. And I think humans for a long time, they thought of themselves as just better than other creations because we're more intelligent. Well, that may not be the case anymore when ChatGPT or Gemini or Copilot can process and write things quicker than you can. So what are the other aspects of humans? Whether you mentioned already, Rachel, the heart, the idea of a soul, of a body, right? How do these things make us human? So that's where I'm thinking, but I haven't come to any particular conclusion.
In reading about AI, one of the things I was fascinated to learn is that we tend to, in the West, be looking at disembodied versions of AI, but in Japan and in the East, they are more developing robots and embodied forms of artificial intelligence. And for now, it's still kind of amazing that the most sophisticated machine has a really difficult time doing what a 3-year-old can do, right, in terms of moving the body. But that probably won't be permanent. And they've already made great strides. So how do we think about it differently if they do have bodies? Because that may not be what's being thought of.
All right, here's an adaptation, and I think this will be our last question. We talked a lot about excavating and being interreligious in public. And then there was a comment, I think, Eunice, that you made earlier about incorporating this in schools and in sort of other places. Could you expand on that? On what is excavating? How could we all be excavators of religious diversity in public?
One of the things, well, first of all, I think it's a great opportunity to shout out about the work that ICJS does in training high school teachers around how do you deal with religious diversity and how you address religion in the classroom in ways that nurture pluralist thinking and respect across difference. But while I did that, I kind of lost my train of thought. All right, now you have the 3:30 in the morning break. Can you read the question again?
Yeah, so my adaptation, whether I can be faithful to my own adaptation, is also going to be tested. Thinking about excavation and religious diversity and spiritual principles, how would you think about incorporating those into public school curriculums in particular? And could you just kind of expand on that?
Well, I do think that it's, one of the things you said in the first iteration was how can we all be excavators? And this comes up because when I teach online classes largely for my students, and so the community-facing work needs to be in their communities. And a lot of times folks in small towns will say, well, it's just a bunch of churches. And I'll say, I bet not. Excavate your own community and discover the religious diversity that's there, and meet and see what kind of work you can collectively be doing together in the community. How can you visualize difference, and how can you maximize the value of your differences in doing work together? So I think that we do all have excavating work to do. And I do think that we all, both through formal programs and in our own lives, just need to, as much as possible, be building relationships across a variety of differences, including the ones, whichever ones are hardest. The political ones are the hardest ones for me. But now that I live in Michigan City, Indiana, rather than Chicago, I have plenty of opportunity. And it's critical work. In the high schools, there are a number of people, I think, actually throughout K through 12 education, there are a number of organizations, you probably know more about this than me, you should answer this question, but there are a number of organizations that have been working on how can you not teach religion, but teach about religion in a way that's faithful to the diversities of your community and of the country and of the world, and can we develop enough curricula and guidelines to really believe that it would be implemented well, even in places that, if the teacher believes this really is a white Christian country, how will that curriculum get implemented there? So it's a can of worms kind of set of issues that a lot of thoughtful people are working on.
I also want to commend ICJS on their work, and especially on congregations as well as high schools and higher education. So it's nice to see how dynamic the organization is and how many audiences and publics they reach. Oftentimes in the university, we're just focusing on one very narrow public of our students, 18 to 22-year-olds, and that's often important, very important public. But there is so much more outreach that we can do. So I think in terms of the curriculum, I'm in Shenandoah University, and most of my classes are in general education. So most students no longer are taking religious studies to become pastors or rabbis or imams. So they are taking this as part of another major that they have. So I think, as folks who are dedicated to this work, have to think about how can we teach people like that who are not necessarily going to specialize or major in our discipline, that we're not really replicating ourselves, but we're actually trying to enhance religious and interreligious literacy. So I think that really changes our approach. That has to be one of maybe of a great books approach or humanities or liberal studies, that we're trying to teach transferable skills. We're trying to teach truths or virtues that people have found meaningful. We're trying to teach about the human experience, religion, and spirituality. And also what I've seen maybe within the high schools or around in other universities is still this focus on a world religions approach, that they're trying to teach about different religions and different ideas without necessarily having that relational experience, that actually going out and meeting people of difference, meeting people of different faith backgrounds, having a friend from a different racial or religious background. So I think that needs to transform the way we think about our education. A lot of times in college, our tests are really the final paper. You have a blue book, you do a midterm, you submit it, you do maybe a presentation, and then you're done. But you don't really necessarily get the opportunity to meet someone that actually believes in those ideas you studied. So I think that is really crucial. I've been investing a lot in virtual exchange, where students in my classrooms are interacting with people from all over the world through WhatsApp or Zoom. So I think the more we make our curriculums human and relational, I think the better our literacy will be.
Thank you for both the shout out to our teachers' work and for being with us today. I also want to direct, if you want to have a conversation about religion in schools, Christine Gallagher here, she could raise her hand. She's like, why are you doing this to me, Heather? Is the director of our programs of teachers in schools. And she recently just published a volume that she co-edited with a few other folks on interreligious literacy in K-12 schools. So I think we've come to a point where we need to conclude this rich conversation. So please join me in thanking Rachel and Eunice